Chapter 14, Fever Dreams. Sam didn't eat anything at supper or at breakfast the next morning. Ma and Pa settled him in some blankets piled on a trunk in the wagon, and he rode there for the next 3 days. Ranger walked alongside Lizzie and Amelia, but every time the wagon stopped, he leaped onto the back and found his way back to Sam. Dr. Loring came by at the end of every day on the trail. He cut Sam's arm so the bad blood could drain out, but Sam still shivered under his scratchy wool blanket. Ma was afraid he had cholera, like Sarah's mother and father, but Dr. Loring pointed to the red spots spreading from Sam's wrists and ankles right up his arms and legs. "Mountain fever," he said, studying the rash. "It's dangerous, but I think you'll make it." On the morning of the 4th day, Sam's skin wasn't so hot. He even got up and walked behind the wagon for a bit. But when night fell, the fever came back, and it was worse. Much worse. Sam was shaking his head and twitching his limbs as if some invisible wolf had gotten a hold of him. Dr. Loring came and gave Sam some medicine, but he spit it back up. Dr. Loring turned to Ma and shook his head. "The second phase is usually worse than the first. All we can do is pray." "Come on, dog, get down," Lizzie called, but Ranger wouldn't leave Sam's side. When Luke was sick last year, Ranger had stayed with him the whole time, sleeping beside him in bed. Luke had gotten better. Sam would too. He had to, didn't he? Days passed, but Sam didn't improve. When Sam shivered, Ranger curled up close to him. When Sam cried out, Ranger licked his hand. Mostly Ranger sat beside him, keeping watch. Ranger heard Lizzie say they were almost to the Oregon Territory. Any day Uncle Thomas would come down the river to meet them and see them back to the farm. Sam had to get better. He had waited so long to see this new country. Ranger ate the scraps that were offered at night, but nothing tasted the same when Sam wasn't eating. The days blurred together until finally Ranger woke one morning to find Sam sitting up beside him, blinking into the rising sun. "Good morning, dog. I'm thirsty and hungry, I think." Ranger wasn't sure what Sam wanted, but he understood the most important thing. Sam was back. Ranger barked, and Ma came running. She just about smothered Sam in hugs and cornbread. When Sam first stood up, his legs were as wobbly as a newborn colt's, but the color was coming back to his cheeks. At the end of the day, a wagon appeared on the trail coming from the other direction. Ma raised her hand to shade her eyes from the sun. "William, I do believe that's your brother's team." Lizzie gathered her skirts in her arms and broke into a run. Even though he was still weak, Sam took Amelia's hand and followed. "Uncle Thomas!" The wagon stopped alongside the trail. A sturdy-looking man jumped down from his horse and came running with a floppy-eared dog alongside him. Uncle Thomas looked a little older than Pa, with the same scruffy red hair and green eyes. He rushed up to the Abbott's wagon, hugging Ma and fussing over the baby and telling Amelia how grown up she was. The dog nearly knocked Amelia off her feet. "Finnegan!" Uncle Thomas called, and the dog barked. "Leave that little miss alone." Finnegan jumped up on Sam and nuzzled his hand. "Does Finnegan live on the farm?" Sam asked. Uncle Thomas nodded. "He'll wake you up every morning, I promise." "Did you hear that dog?" Sam turned to the wagon where Ranger had been standing, watching. Ranger barked and tipped his head, but he stayed by the wagon. He had heard Uncle Thomas. He had heard Sam, and now he heard something else. A high-pitched humming coming from inside the wagon. It was getting louder and louder. Ranger hopped up on the tailgate and found it right away. The metal box from the garden at home was there, where Ma had tucked it next to the tools on that first day, way back in the dusty square. The box was vibrating urgently. Ranger had done a good job. Now it was time to go home. Ranger grabbed the leather strap with his teeth, dragged it to the wagon's tailgate, and jumped down. Sam was watching him. Ranger knew he couldn't leave without saying goodbye. Everyone was getting ready to start off again to finish the journey. The metal box was humming so loud it seemed to be shaking the whole earth. But Ranger set it down in the dirt, ran to Sam, and licked his hand. "Dog, this is Finnegan," Sam said, squatting to introduce them. Finnegan nuzzled Sam's ear, then turned to look at Ranger curiously. "Who are you?" the other dog seemed to ask. Finnegan sniffed Ranger as if he didn't quite belong. "We're going home now," Sam said, "to the farm." Ranger sniffed Finnegan. He was a good dog. He'd take care of Sam. "Sam, come along," Pa called. "We need to make 10 more miles before dark." Ranger licked Sam's hand once more and turned away. "Where are you going, dog?" Sam looked confused. He stood up, and one of the quilt squares fluttered down from his pocket. "Aren't you coming?" Ranger sniffed the square, then picked it up carefully in his teeth. "You want to carry that for me?" "Here." Sam took the bit of fabric and tucked it under Ranger's collar. "All set now?" "Let's go, son," Pa called. "That dog will follow if he wants to. We need to get moving." But Sam didn't move. He watched Ranger trot back to the first aid kit and sit down. Finally, Sam nodded as if he understood. "Thanks, dog," he said quietly. But Ranger heard, even over the humming that threatened to swallow him up. He watched Sam run to catch up with Lizzie and Finnegan and the wagon. When Ranger nuzzled the dusty leather strap over his head, the humming drowned out all the sounds of the trail. The snorting and shouting, the clomping of oxen hooves, and the neighing of horses. Ranger saw a pinprick of white light that grew bigger and bigger until it swallowed up the Oregon sun, and Ranger had to close his eyes. When he opened them, there was a squirrel.